Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Twilight Zone review. Today it is Season 4, Episode 11, The Parallel, written by Rod Serling and starring Steve Forrest as Robert Gaines and Jacqueline Scott as Helen Gaines. And this is a solid hour-long episode that has a very interesting concept. It doesn't quite hit the great level. I don't think it quite has the impact it could have. And that is mostly because I do feel it is somewhat padded, and also some of the execution and focus of the episode I think is a little off, but it's an interesting episode overall. So we actually start with Helen, the wife of our lead character, which is interesting, and she's waiting for her husband to go off into space with their daughter as well, and you can tell they're very concerned about this, which makes sense, especially at this time when space was even more unknown than it is now. And then we go to a scene with Robert, and a friend of his, a colonel, is there, and he's just waiting to go into space, basically talking about it, and he seems to be okay with it. And we get a parallel scene, which is very important to the episode, with Helen and the daughter watching this on TV, but right before he goes completely up, they turn the TV off. So like I said, you can tell they're really concerned about it. And eventually, while in space, Robert loses contact with everyone and isn't sure what happens. So we go to the next scene, and he's in bed being examined, and he says he blacked out and doesn't know what happened, and we were not shown what happened, so we don't really know either. This is done pretty well. It gives us a good sense of mystery, and this whole episode has kind of an odd, creepy feel to it, so that part is well done. Is well done, excuse me. So we find out that Bob blacked out. I'll call him Bob for the rest of the episode because that's what everyone calls him. He says he doesn't know anything about what happens. He can't remember anything other than he landed the spacecraft, but nothing else makes any sense. He's not even really sure how he did that. So the mystery continues. So he now goes home and he meets his wife there, and everything seems okay for about a minute until he says there's a new fence there. Where did that fence come from? And his wife Helen says the fence has always been there. And then some other weird things start to happen. Bob has a colonel's shirt on, but he says he's only a major. But then he sees a picture of himself, and it turns out he is a colonel. So he asks his wife, what rank was I? And she says, you were a colonel. So at this point he knows something is wrong, but he's not sure what. And they just talk about all the strange things that are going on, and you can tell they're concerned about it. He says there has to be something wrong, but his wife tries to reassure him it must just be you were in space and you're a little disoriented. So then they have a kiss, and Helen backs away from this with a very strange and concerned look on her face. She has an odd feeling, and you can tell something really disturbed her about this kiss and what happened. So we go to another scene after this where his daughter brings him coffee, and he says he doesn't take sugar in it, and this is kind of odd. It's never explained, but the daughter just says, you're different. How she knows he's different, I'm not really sure. I guess she just senses it, which is fine. It makes sense. We don't need a big explanation on this. I do like the way they use the child to always express her feelings openly, because she would be more likely to tell him something was wrong probably than an adult. She wouldn't be as subtle about it. So I felt this was realistic and done well. And at this point Helen does finally agree. She says something is wrong with you. So Bob says I will go in for a psychiatric evaluation. So he does go to a psychiatrist, and there's a scene where he explains that Bob really gave nothing away. He figures it's just some kind of delusions, but he says they're odd delusions, so the doctor can't really make sense of it either. And the colonel is there, and Helen is there, and basically nothing is solved here. So one major key point to this was that Bob mentioned that Kennedy was president, and they don't know who Kennedy is. They have no idea. So at this point I think we're starting to get the point that either he's gone through time or it has to be a parallel universe. It was probably harder for the audience to decipher this back then, but it seems those are really the only two conclusions we can come to at this point, and this is where the episode loses some steam for me. It really takes a long time for everyone to figure out what's going on, and a lot of the scenes just feel like rehashes of earlier scenes, and I really thought the momentum really slowed down at this point, but it's still okay. It's interesting enough. So Helen and the colonel have a talk. She's obviously very concerned about what's going on, and Bob comes in the room, and he starts saying a lot of facts don't match up, and he says history is different, and he also says a lot of the people are the same, and the streets and everything, a lot of the facts are the same, just slight little things are different. I would have liked a little bit more on why these things are different instead of just rehashing old scenes over again about how everybody's concerned. We get that they're concerned at this point. So Bob says, I'll prove to you something's different, and he calls his daughter downstairs and he says, who am I? And she says, I do not know who you are. Then we cut to a scene, very abruptly I might add, about from the man who built the spacecraft, and he is telling the general, who's also been in the episode here and there, that he knows for sure that this is a different spacecraft than the one he built, so he's proving basically what we already know, that Gaines came back in a different ship. Again, this is stuff that we kind of already figure, and feels a little bit like exposition the way this is done, but I guess it's necessary for the episode. So they ask Bob to come in and check out the craft because they want proof one way or the other. They're not really sure what to think. And all of a sudden, Bob just starts hearing these noises in his head. This is done pretty well. And then we cut back very abruptly to Bob in the ship, and we see a little bit more of what happened there. And we now know for sure that he was in some kind of parallel dimension, and he is now back in the hospital, and all the same people are there that were there in our first hospital scene, and they all know that Kennedy is president. So now we know we're back in the dimension that Bob already knows, the parallel world. Now what's interesting is that he remembers everything about his experience in the other dimension in this one, but yet he didn't know what was going on when he was in the other dimension for a short time. Is that because this was his first dimension? Is this the one he really belongs in? They don't really explain it, which is fine, but like I said, the execution of all of it just feels a little bit off in spots, but overall it's very thought-provoking, and everything doesn't always need to be spelled out, so it's fine. I just thought it was interesting he remembered everything in this scene. That was, but you might find it to your satisfaction. I guess it's okay. So it turns out that we get another scene with the colonel and the general. We got one of these earlier in the episode, and they're doubting him just like they did in the other dimension, which I thought was humorous. It is a hard thing to believe, I suppose. And then they get a message that they had contact with another spacecraft, and it was Bob, and now they learn for sure that there was proof that he was in a parallel dimension because they made this brief contact with another man in the same situation, and that would link up well with the scene earlier when he was hearing the voices in his head. So that part's done well. It's satisfactory. So then we get a last scene, which of course we get, where Bob goes home and his daughter and his wife know him. So it's a happy ending for him in that dimension. But what's interesting is we're not really sure what happens to him in the other dimension if he ever gets his problems resolved and people believe him. So that's fine. It's a solid episode overall. I just personally would have liked the execution to be a little different. But the parallel is worth watching for the reasons I said, and I give it a 3 out of 5. It's not a perfect episode, but it's a good one. So a 3 out of 5 for the parallel, and as always, thanks for watching.